The coronavirus pandemic has been disruptive to all of us, including our animals. Many pets have loved getting to spend more time with us, while others may be a little exhausted from the extra attention. As we return to more normal routines, it's important to make a plan to help your animals and your family transition back to work, school and everyday commitments. Today we have parenting and family psychology expert Professor Matt Sanders and child and family psychologist and researcher Dr. Kylie Burke with us to share some great tips for helping children learn empathy and responsibility by taking care of family pets. They'll also discuss how we should be looking after our pets at this point in time.
I always said I'd never have a dog, but it's been so good for our boys just to sort of, learn to take care of another creature, but also they just show so much affection for her.
I think the kids were exhausting the dog. They constantly were playing and walking her.
Animals are a really important part of many people's lives. In Australia, for example, over 24 million pets are sharing our homes, and 62% of households have at least one animal. Now, most people, over 65% in fact, describe their animals as members of their family. There are many benefits to sharing life with animals, like better self-esteem, feeling less lonely, and the development of social skills such as being able to understand the perspective of others. There can also be physical benefits for people from getting out and about with pets, walking the dog for instance, riding a horse. Now Kylie, from your experience, how do you think children benefit from having a life with animals?
And Matt, there's some really significant benefits for children. In fact, the emotional bond that we develop with our animals can have similar benefits to what we get from our relationships with people. We can experience connection and love, a sense of belonging, all through our relationships with animals. And that's true for children as it is for us as adults. In fact, for some kids, it's even more important, and particularly kids who are struggling. The relationship with the family pet offers a greater sense of companionship than they might be getting from their friendships with other children or their relationships with other children. More broadly, animals act as playmates and companions for children, and they can offer a sense of security as well as that sense of being loved and accepted. Having animals can also help children to develop a sense of responsibility by providing them with some positive experiences associated with taking care of another living being. And it also helps to develop compassion and empathy, both for animals but also for other people. An important part, though, that I just want to note before we move on from that, Matt, is that it's not just having the animal that makes a difference. It's actually doing things and having responsibility for the animal that makes the difference.
So these are really very important benefits to children, aren't they, of having a pet? And you can see just how closely linked it is to the development of things that are kind of like drivers of children's development.
Yes, for sure. It's linked to just about every aspect of development. It isn't social, psychological, their physical well-being, being active, their cognitive, their ability to think and plan. So yeah, it goes right across their life.
I've seen some pretty reluctant dogs being dragged on walks around our neighbourhood. Poor things.
Our cats have loved us working from home. There's always a lap to keep them warm.
The pandemic has led many people to spend far more time with their animals, even adding new animals to their lives, hasn't it? What has this meant for our animals?
Yeah, it has. Some shelters have reported having no animals in their shelters. On the surface, it seems like this would be really amazing for our animals to be with their people all the time. And for many of them, it has been. They get to sleep at our feet or on our laps while we're working. They get to follow us around and have extra walks and playtimes. And for kittens and puppies in particular, it provides time for us to bond and settle them into our families. But there is also quite a substantial number of animals for whom it's quite stressful and even exhausting to have us with them all the time. Particularly animals that are more solitary or nervous, like, for example, either sick animals or our senior animals, whom perhaps need more rest and space to themselves. Like children, animals thrive on living in a safe, caring and predictable environment. You'll know people, and you might have had this in your own family, Matt, that when you go to put on your shoes, your dog knows exactly whether or not you're going to take them for a walk or whether you're leaving the house for work or some other purpose. And this is an example of how our animals learn our routines, and that's what creates the predictability for them. The pandemic, though, has thrown many of our usual routines out the window. We've been home all the time, so our animals can't predict when we might leave them. On top of that, they're getting lots more attention and exercise. So as families, one of the really great things that I've seen around the pandemic is we're out and about with our children, taking them on bike rides and walks, and our animals are very often involved in all of those extra activities. So this, while it's great in lots of ways, can also mean that their rest time is disrupted. And for some, it can even mean that the demands on their physical fitness have been really intensified, perhaps even beyond where they're able to cope or manage. The other thing about it is that it has meant much more contact with children. And that's been great for many animals, but it can lead to a number of problems as well.
Just tell us a little bit more about the problems you're referring to there.
Well, from an animal's perspective, children, and particularly young children, can be really confusing and unpredictable. I mean, we all know children can be loud and they move about really suddenly, just in their play or which can be in their excitement or in their worry. So for an animal, hearing a child suddenly squeal or jump up and down in excitement can be really scary or worrying, particularly if an animal's not used to children. And this is true not only for our animals at home, but for when we're out and about in the world with our children and we see other people's animals. So animals are also a really great playmate for children. However, the increased time together that's been brought about by the pandemic, and for us as parents, we're trying to balance working from home with caring for our children, can mean that the family pet has been in much greater demand, whether the animal likes it or not. A lot of people who have cats might particularly have noticed that. Cats like their space and may not be appreciating the intrusion of having little feet and hands around them at a much greater amount of time. And the issue that I think really comes up is that if animals become worried or feel as though they can't escape from unwanted or even really inappropriate interactions by children, then this is when problems might occur. And some of those can be really serious, from being scratched to bites to the child and even injury to the animal. So this is something we really need to think about as parents.
So what kind of advice would you give to parents about setting their children and pets up for a successful relationship with each other?
Well, I think the very first thing is that we need to know what are the signs of animal distress or discomfort. When are our animals telling us and telling our children that they want us to let them go and let them have some space? And that can be things like their ears being flat to their head, or showing the whites of their eyes, curling their lip, having their tail down low, even if it's wagging. A wagging tail on either a cat or a dog does not necessarily mean happy wag. It's a different type of slow, low wag is a sign of discomfort for an animal. And of course, growling and then moving into biting. Obviously, the earliest that we can get in, the better for both our children and our animals. Scratching and biting is very rarely the animal's first sign that they're unhappy. It's often their last resort. It's the only way they can find to get away from a scary or even painful interaction. So if they feel that those other signs have not been noticed, then that's when we can see these bigger problems. What it comes down to is that it's our job as parents to supervise our children and our animals together. Even as our children are learning to take on more responsibility for caring for the animals, the responsibility for supervising and making sure that everybody's safe still rests with us as adults. And it's important that we intervene early, and that might include rescuing your animal or redirecting your child off to another activity to give your animal some space. And there are a number of things that we can do to teach our children and to promote those positive kinds of interactions between children and animals. The first would be to teach our children directly how to interact safely and respectfully with animals. So what does safe patting look like? What parts of the body does an animal like to be touched? And this differs between animals. So cats very often do not like having their tummy rubbed, whereas many dogs do. So parents knowing their own animal so that they can help their child to understand what their animal will accept is important. Getting kids involved in caring for the animal, feeding them, brushing them, walking them, playing with them, are all really important ways to help children learn to interact respectfully and to develop a bond with their animal that will have those benefits we talked about earlier. Teaching our children the signs that our animal is saying, "That's enough, thank you," and teaching our children how to let go and walk away and give the animal some space is really important.
It occurs to me as you're sharing some of these thoughts that one of the most significant things children are learning is actually how to be observant, because if they're not noticing and interpreting the cues appropriately about, whether the animal likes something or not, they're less likely to be able to respond in an appropriate way. And I can see that parents actually have a really important role in alerting the kids to those cues and helping them interpret them.
Absolutely. And so it comes right back to parents modelling for their children what's expected and what's okay, so that children can learn from watching their parents, but also from being directly prompted, as you've just said. So the other thing here is to remember that when we're giving responsibility to our kids, we always need to take into account their age and where they're at developmentally. It's also important to make sure that you've thought about and have made an area for your animals which is a safe child-free zone where they can escape, or you can put them so that they can have that chill out rest time, and that you as a parent enforce that children are not to go and bother your animals when they are in that space. Particularly important when you've got really young animals or old or nervous animals. And of course, as with all parenting, when our kids are showing us their responsibility, being positive in their interactions and following the rules, we want to let them know through lots of praise and attention.
Which of course they can use with their animals as well when the animal is behaving appropriately in a particular situation.
Absolutely.
I'm worried the dog is going to fret now more that we're away from the house. The kids are back at school and I've started going into the office, so now she's all by herself after all these months.
So as we move back to work and school, this also is a time where there's a potential for some negative effects for our animals as well, isn't it?
As we start to leave the house again, our animals are going to be likely to experience some stress and anxiety. They've had us at home for months in many parts of the world, and certainly in Australia we've had 4 or 5 months of them having us with them every day of the week. So without us around to that extent, we may see them become more frustrated or bored from being left for long periods, as well as just feeling lonely and stressed. Of course, they can't tell us this with anything other than behaviour, and the behaviour that will often come out with animals is problem behaviour like weeing and pooing in the house, or even destructive behaviours like barking, whining or howling, chewing on our furniture if they're inside, digging up our garden if they're outside.
So Kylie, how do you think we can best set up our pets for success as we transition back to having less time at home?
Well, as we've already talked about, we know animals thrive on feeling safe and living in that predictable environment, so knowing what to expect of their day. So we need to start prepping them for being without us before we actually have to be away from them. It's important to avoid making a sudden or really large change. So some things that you can think about doing are decide where your animal will be left when you're gone and animal-proof that area so that it's a safe, interesting and comfortable zone for them. If you've got puppies or new dogs, playpens or temporary fencing can be helpful. And you can also limit access to rooms or areas that are unsafe or that are special to you or your children. Teach them that being alone is okay. If your animal has spent all day on your lap or in the same room as you, try starting to add some times in the day where they're not with you. by leaving them in the area that they're going to be when you go back to work. And then gradually increase this time as your animal shows that they're coping. It's also important that while you're doing that you're preparing ways that you can keep them busy and positively occupied when you're not there. Think about things like problem-solving games or long-lasting treats that are going to keep them entertained for hours at a time. The other thing that I would suggest that people think about doing is to create or maintain, if you've set some up, exercise and feeding routines that will fit in with your family's work and other activities going forward. Think about the things that you did with your children and with your animals while you were at home that brought you all some joy, and then try to build these into your new normal once you're back at work and school. And of course, as always, we want to keep a good eye on our animals' health to make sure that we're not missing anything now that we're not with them all the time.
So really having animals in our lives brings many, many benefits to us and our children in terms of both companionship and caring. It seems to me that it also brings incredible responsibility to promote a safe, caring and predictable environment for both our children and our animals. And this is a pretty major responsibility for parents. So Kylie, when you think about everything that we've talked about in this episode, is there any single key take-home point that you would like to share with parents out there?
The main message, I think, is that having animals in our lives brings enormous benefit to children across all aspects of their life. Handing over responsibility to our children remains an adult responsibility, an adult job. So even though our children might have jobs like feeding them or grooming them or taking them for a walk, the ultimate responsibility of keeping everybody safe stays with mum and dad, which means that we always need to know what our children are doing with our animals when they're with them and who else is around to keep everyone safe.
And these are the fundamental skills of positive parenting, aren't they?
Absolutely, exactly the same.
That's all for this episode of Parenting in a Pandemic. Here are some tips for promoting positive relationships between children and animals. Tip number 1, keep an eye on your children's interactions with family animals and teach them how to play and care for them. Tip number 2, it's also important to teach them signs an animal is not happy and when to give them space. And tip number 3, try to maintain the positive routines you started during isolation and make sure your pet is ready for some more alone time. Thanks for listening to Parenting in a Pandemic. If you're enjoying this podcast, make sure you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to leave a review. It'll help others to find this series. You can find free COVID-19 Parenting in a Pandemic resources in the episode show notes to help you on this journey.